I'd like to bring our next speaker to the stage. You're here on the Developer Toolkit stage, sponsored by Agora.io. It's 4:20 in the UK on BST, and wherever you are, you're very welcome to join us. And I'd like you to give a virtual round of applause to our next speaker, who's Arran Topalian from Mediatonic, here to talk to us about demystifying the development of games we play together. The Developer Toolkit stage is all about practical tools and advice for developers. So I know you're going to want to check in on this one, and hopefully we've got some of our audio sorted out. Arran, are you there?
Yep, I'm here just about. I'll work.
Hey, excellent. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it and taking your time. Look, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to step back and let you take the stage and give your presentation. In a little bit, I'll rejoin you and help you curate some of those questions. So, folks, if you have some questions here for Mediatonic, do drop them in the Q&A box at the bottom, and I'll help you work through those later. But in the meantime, I'm ducking back out again. Arran, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dave. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen, and we can get started. Okay. So, yeah, hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to my talk today on multiplayer, demystifying the development of games we play together. I'm just going to go to the taskbar here if I can. Now I have. We've not got long, and there's a lot to demystify in 20 minutes, so I'm just going to jump right in. So playing together is something we as human beings have been doing for a very long time. The first known examples of a team game, for example, involving a ball, occurred in Mesoamerican cultures over 3,000 years ago. The ball, which was made of rock, would symbolize the sun, and the captain of the losing team would be sacrificed to the gods, which is a bit different from being given a little band around your arm. So considering how deeply rooted this dynamic is, it's no wonder that a lot of the biggest sports and video games to date are typically games that we play together. I'm sure you're all very familiar with this example, Fortnite. It's somewhat of a phenomenon in cross-platform. As of last month, 350 million players had registered with Fortnite. And recently, 27 million players logged into the game to attend a virtual music performance. So I think it's safe to say it's somewhat of a golden age right now, if anything, for multiplayer games. Server costs have fallen dramatically with the rise in growth in cloud computing. Broadband internet and always-on mobile connections continue to spread. So today I want to cover some of the best design practices that I've learned working on this kind of game so far, which has somehow taken up the majority of my career to date. So a quick introduction before we go any deeper into some of the good stuff. My name is, like I say, Arran Topalian. I've worked in the industry now for just over 7 years. I've worked at a bunch of different places during that time on a bunch of different genres of game, such as Rare on Sea of Thieves, Microsoft Research Cambridge, and Oculus. And most recently, I've been working at Mediatonic. I've been at Mediatonic for just under 3 years now. I worked there as a senior game designer, and I spent 2.5 of those years working on the top-grossing mobile game Yahtzee with Buddies. So we all know what the title of the talk is, but what does that title actually mean? And what are you actually going to get out of this talk and spend 20 minutes of your life and precious time listening to and learning about? So essentially, it translates to something slightly longer and a bit more of a mouthful, but it's essentially best design practices to consider when developing mobile multiplayer games from a designer's perspective, at least, which I myself wish I'd known about a bit sooner. Multiplayer is a very broad spectrum, and so there's a lot to demystify in general, let alone in 20 minutes. So the best practices that I've painstakingly chosen are fairly broad, but in turn highly applicable, that can cover the development process, essentially from ideation all the way through to post-release. So hopefully there's going to be at least something in there for everyone to take away. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is premise and mental models. Now, obviously, premise in any game is hugely important, but I would argue it's even more so in multiplayer games. Players are the lifeblood of a multiplayer experience. If you don't have anyone to play with, then the whole thing kind of falls apart. So coming up with a premise that's as approachable and appealing and comprehensible for your target audience as possible can obviously be a massive help. So when coming up with a premise or such a premise, I've often relied on mental models. So a mental model is how we simplify complexity. We can't keep all the details of the world in our brains. Some of us try. So we use models to simplify the complex into understandable, recallable chunks. And also as human beings, it's worth bearing in mind that these mental models can come with emotions attached, which means that we might be more receptive to certain mental models than others because we associate them with happier memories. So a premise that taps into a pre-existing mental model can really help not only your player understand what's expected of them quicker, it can also help your experience click better with your players. And it can also even help you as the designer get a clearer sense of how that experience is going to work or its mechanics. So to give an example of this, a while back now, I worked on a feature for Yahtzee Buddies called Families. And this is essentially a clan type experience where players could scroll through a virtual space to engage with groups of their choosing. And soon after its release, which was a strong release, players took to Families well. We decided, okay, we've got players to group up, but now we need to give them something to do together. So to meet those requirements, I designed a feature called Family Feast. And the rules of Family Feast, this is a screenshot of Family Feast here, where fairly simple. Players have to play Yahtzee to earn ingredients, which are these little sort of bags of goodies at the bottom of each of the kitchen counters. And these ingredients all contribute to a recipe, which the whole family is also collecting ingredients for, which you can see at the top of the screen with the various bags and little numbers next to them. So this feature became hugely popular with players. It boosted our KPIs considerably, and it also had a great emotional response from our players. But this wasn't something that just popped into my head. It was a premise, it was based rather on a premise that was something quite universal and applicable, which was cooking or the act of preparing a meal. And also it's worth saying this is a mental model that I felt may have had a higher chance of resonating with the game's target audience, which did turn out to be the case. These mental models can also exist in our minds, not just because we've experienced them in the real world, they can also exist because they've been created by other games. So this game right here is a multiplayer focused game called Tricky Towers, which I highly recommend if you haven't played it before, it's a lot of fun. But just by looking at this screenshot alone, a lot of you probably know how this game works already, right? Because you're familiar with Tetris. So straight off the bat, that mental model can help communicate the premise of a multiplayer experience that you've never even seen before, which can be incredibly useful in terms of approachability and better ensuring as many people can play and want to play as possible. As a designer, you can also take mental models you yourself possess and reuse them. So another example from Yahtzee is mystery cards in Dice World Race. And this is a screenshot here of Dice World Race from Yahtzee with Buddies in the game. So in Dice World Race, the objective is to play games of Yahtzee to earn points. Points earn you steps, and steps get you around the track. And the player with the most steps, or who finish in the top 2 positions because they've earned the most steps, win the best prizes. So one space on the board, this little guy right here, is the mystery card space. So when you land on this space, you get, unsurprisingly, a mystery card. And mystery cards essentially reward the player with additional bonus steps. So this is great not only for the players who are far behind in the race because they need to catch up and it can get them back into the race. It's also great in terms of players who are in the lead. It keeps these players on their toes, and it can also encourage monetization even further through dice rerolls to earn more points, earn more steps, and maintain their lead. So super useful. But again, this mechanic wasn't just plucked out of thin air either. It was actually based on my pre-existing understanding of the bullet bill power-up in Mario Kart, which is basically a supercharged autopilot power-up that you're more likely to get the further back you are in a race. So using mental models can really help when it comes to your games, your multiplayer games premise, as well as its mechanics. So next up, I'd like to talk about prototyping and playtests. Right after a sip of water. So yeah, the importance of this really can't be stressed enough, especially for multiplayer games. Even if it's just with pencil and paper and erasers, it's vital that you prototype your multiplayer experience out as soon as possible. Here we have a charming photo of Mediatonic's own creative director, Jeff Tenton and Tom Bush, one of our lead designers, meticulously prototyping the very early beginnings of Gears Pop, using a somewhat arcane combination of batteries, paper, and figurines. So, of course, it does take extra time and resources to prototype and to go off and find the batteries, but it may be a time very well spent. It's hard enough as a designer and a developer to encourage and anticipate the behaviors of a single player with a certain set of mechanics. It's a totally different ballgame when there's a variable as big and unpredictable as another player or several other players added into the equation. And it may be the case that something you design with the best intentions will be used by players in a way that it totally wasn't intended for. And one example of this that I really like occurred actually during the development of that game company's Journey. So Journey's development took 3 years, which was longer than originally anticipated because the team had to change the design of the game to ensure that everyone got the same experience and the experience that the designers wanted those players to have, which ultimately provided them with the foundation for their latest mobile release, Sky Children of Light. So as Geneva Chen described it, for quite a while we had players being very mean to each other. People are really aggressive in many other games online. When the same player playing Call of Duty came over to Journey, we were expecting to reveal a positive side of humanity rather than a nasty side, but it didn't happen. So originally in Journey, players were able to physically push other players to help them get to higher locations. But playtesters ended up using that ability to shove other players instead or push them into pits so they would die, which is quite far removed from the Journey we know to be. So this really just underlines the vital importance of playtesting your multiplayer game. It's also very important to think about how you're going to run your multiplayer experience playtests. So if your experience is somewhat of a couch co-op one, then something like this, albeit maybe a little bit less cheesy and not involving original PlayStation controllers, is going to be fine. Odds are people playing that kind of game are going to know each other fairly well, and communication is going to be fairly wide open because they're sat right next to each other. But if you're working on a multiplayer experience that's typically strangers playing remotely, very possibly without a means of communicating or even an interest in communicating with each other, then something like this isn't going to be very useful for you when running your playtests to get a real sense of exactly what impact your game is having. So if that is the case, I'd highly recommend running your playtests first and foremost without voice chat or text chat, if that's what your game involves, unless of course these are integral to the experience. If this is how your product is going to be experienced realistically for the most part out in the wild, then ideally that's how you need to be running your playtests. You can even go one step further and don't even let your playtesters be in the same room as each other. Things like laughter can be quite contagious. And if one playtester is, for example, laughing, which is great, it can mean that this can discolor the results of your playtest because it affects the other playtesters in the room. And above all, don't playtest with friends. I mean, you can if you want. It's a lot of fun to playtest with friends. We all love doing things with friends or groups of friends, but ultimately anything we play with our friends can be fun in some way, shape, or form, and can end up, again, discoloring the results of our playtests. As a quick mention as well, another part of prototyping and playtesting your multiplayer experience is how you take in and evaluate feedback, which can be especially tricky for multiplayer games, which can generate a lot of feedback because there's a lot of players involved. So one method that I really like using and have done in the past is using Robert Plutchik's Wheel of Emotions, which can really help identify the fun aspects and pain points in your design really well. And it sort of generates essentially a game designer's heat map. So the idea is that after your playtest, playtesters can write down magic moments or memorable events that happened to them during their playtest and can stick them or attach them, if you've done it digitally, to the Wheel of Emotion to signify how that event made them feel. And what you end up getting at the end is a sort of a very visual sense of what emotions your prototype is making the players feel, but also, more helpfully, what's making them feel that way and where problems might lie. And the last thing I'd like to touch on is the social factor of your multiplayer experience, or gilding up, as I like to call it. So in another talk by Spryfox's Daniel Cook, he discussed how games that build stronger player relationships and stronger communities will likely have a better retention and improved monetization. And this is mainly because these games are creating value for players that speaks to deeply human psychological needs. But as Daniel Cook also asks, how can your game better support and encourage these relationships to form? So one of the most important aspects of the families feature, which I brought up earlier, is the join now button, which is this guy right here. It's by no means the sexiest part of the feature. It seems quite uninteresting. It's by no means the shiniest either, but it's arguably one of the most important in terms of creating those stronger bonds between players. It's the largest button on the screen because it's the button we want players to tap most, and with very good reason. Essentially, this is the button that comes up when players are looking to join a family for the first time, and we recommend a family to that player. This button isn't just grabbing a random family from the ether. There's actually quite a lot of logic and design thinking going on behind the scenes of this button. It's asking certain questions before it presents a family, like, is there enough group activity in this family? When was the last time a chat log was entered into that family's family chat? Or is this a family that's sort of dying on the vine and is unlikely to generate an awful lot of engagement for the player? Is there anyone in the group the player doesn't like? So are there any players in that family that the player has blocked? For example, to use a real life analogy, you're less likely to go along to a party if you know someone you don't like is going to be there. So the same rule applies here. But conversely, is there anyone that we know they do like in this family? Are there any players that are Facebook friends or favorited players? Again, to use the party analogy, you're more likely to go to that party or stick around longer if there are people that you do like, your friends. Or even things like, does this group speak the same language as the player, language obviously being a major barrier to creating those social bonds. All of these checks are in place to make sure we're surfacing families to the player that they're the most likely to have a positive experience with and engage with frequently. And you can further encourage these bonds to strengthen, as well as encourage players to engage with these kind of socially oriented features in general through in-game incentives. So here we have the help request menu in the family chat. Request menu is a term just slides right off the tongue. All the player has to do is hit one of these request buttons, and it generates a help request in the family chat. And all that has to happen is another player has to come along, tap that help button, and when the progress bar fills up, the player who sent out the request gets their prize. And features like this create what's called reciprocation, a sense of wanting to return a favor, which in turn, again, strengthens those bonds between players through essentially good old-fashioned gratitude. And if you have the time and the resources, using exclusive team-based game modes to incentivize group engagement more and further strengthen the communities can be very effective. And we found to be highly effective on Yahtzee with Buddies, especially if that gameplay creates a real sense of us versus them, which is one of the oldest mental models that there is really. So in Family Feast, which we looked at earlier, we allow for families to compete against each other. So the more ingredients that you will collect, the faster your family finishes recipes. And the faster you finish recipes, the more points you earn, and the higher that your family will place in the leaderboard, and you'll all earn more rewards as a result. So it probably doesn't come as much of a surprise, but a bit of competition between groups can be a very helpful and healthy thing. So to recap, because we covered a lot in a very short space of time, first and foremost, an approachable premise that capitalizes on positive pre-existing mental models can really help. Prototype your multiplayer experience as soon as possible and play test it in realistic conditions. Again, that prototyping can take any form, even if it's just with pencil and paper or batteries, and also support the creation and growth of stronger social bonds between your players. And one final best practice that I could offer for demystifying the games that we play together is quite simply to play games. Just play as many as you possibly can, which almost goes without saying again. But as corny as it sounds, just like a chef needs to eat lots of different types of food to come up with better recipes, so too do we as designers need to play lots of different games to get a sense of not just how they work, but also how they can make us feel. Because as the old saying goes, good artists copy, great artists steal. And that wraps up the talk. Thank you very much for listening. I really hope it's been useful. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them, or feel free to get in touch afterwards. I'll be happy to get back to you. Thank you very much again.
Thanks, Aaron. That was fantastic. Really, really useful. Really informative in a short space of time. Great stuff. And I see we've got a question here from the audience, which I'll share with you. And I've got a couple of things that I'd like to mention as well. I thought the Wheel of Emotion was great, by the way. What a great way of just getting people to articulate how they felt about play during playtesting. Reminds me of actually a very similar device we used during the creation of like magazines and websites called a brand eye, where we get people to talk about how their emotions about what they're reading, and that's great. Is that something that you devised at Mediatonic there, or is that a standard kind of tool?
No, that's something that I picked up from before Mediatonic, and it seemed like a really nice approach at the time. It made a lot of sense because otherwise you end up with spreadsheets or Word docs, and you can get the facts from that. But obviously, a big part of any kind of video game experience is the way that it makes you feel, and this is a nice way of sort of tying the two in. So this was something that came up before.
Great. Well, look, there are a few questions, some here and from others. The first question I'm going to put to you from the audience is from Sai here, who asks, is video chat in multiplayer a distraction or not?
I mean, it can be. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a distraction. It depends in what context. Like if we're talking about video chat as part of the multiplayer game that you're designing, and that's going to be a core part of that experience, then that's fantastic. That actually sounds like a really interesting, really interesting direction. But if it's a means for your playtesters during a prototype playtest to communicate with each other, like I say, unless that's integral to the experience, I would say that could be a distraction. Again, you're allowing players to potentially use something they would otherwise not use. Video chat is fantastic because it's not just voice that you're getting; it's body language and everything else. So if anything, you're giving the player testers more information to work with that they'd probably normally not have.
Yeah, that makes sense. Actually, then a next question here from an anonymous attendee. This is a deep subject. I'm pretty sure I've seen talks that last the entire talk on this subject. But the question is, how do you monetize a multiplayer game?
Yeah, that's going to need another talk.
Absolutely, a number of ways.
There's a number of ways to monetize, and again, it comes down to platform as well. Like if it's and what kind of business, if it's a full free-to-play game, if it's a hybrid game. I would say, I mean, we touched on the importance of social in multiplayer games, and I personally find that a really interesting way to monetize. There's a lot of really interesting things that mobile games especially do right now. Tri-Peak Solitaire does something particularly interesting with its club system, where people can essentially buy gift packs for their club to get. And I think these kind of social things, it's almost like buying around in the pub. Like everyone, it feels good for the person buying it, but it's great for everyone else because, hey, it's a free drink. So those are particularly interesting ways. But yeah, to really get into it, I think we'll need another 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. But we've got a couple of other questions here as well, and we're okay for time, so I'll just crack on if you don't mind answering them. Dan here has asked, have you attempted to deal with toxic behaviors in your game design? Now, you spoke a little bit about some examples from Journey there, but Dan asked, toxic behaviors in game design, and what successes have you had?
So I mean, in the time that I spent working on Sea of Thieves, this was something very much at the front of our minds. I mean, toxic behavior can exist in any game, right? Where multiple players are in the same space. It's actually something that I looked into a little bit. I've experienced it myself in the past and looked at ways to solve it. There's actually a really nice anecdote used by, and a solution used by Valve for Dota, where they relied on psychology to sort of help alleviate player toxicity. It was something called cognitive dissonance. I definitely looking into it, but essentially their solution, which I really liked and I'm waiting for an opportunity to use, is essentially having players report on their own behavior. So they added a questionnaire at the end of your experience where you could rate your own cooperation with other players, not just how other players cooperated with you. And that creates a moment where if you want to give yourself 5 stars, you kind of have to feel like you earned the 5 stars. So you're less like, if you want the 5 stars next time you play, you'll maybe behave a little bit better. And it actually had great results. They ended up having about 130,000 less reports per month because of just this one addition.
Wow. That's nice. That's a very good approach. Yeah, I didn't realize it did that. That's good.
Yeah, it's really cool. But yeah, again, I think it's another talk in and of itself.
Absolutely. Well, look, we've still got some more questions here. Sai again asks, is it okay to put a paywall for multiplayer mode in a game?
I mean, I personally wouldn't say so. I mean, I think a paywall sort of acts as a barrier to entry, and like what I was talking about, for a multiplayer game, players are your lifeblood, right? Like if you don't have players to play with, then the whole thing just doesn't work. Which I think is part of the reason, perhaps, why a lot of very successful, very big multiplayer games are typically free to play for the most part, because there's a very easy, low barrier to entry there where you can get as many players in as possible. So I would never say never. I guess it would depend on what the setup is, but personally, I would say maybe putting a paywall is not the most ideal approach, because you want players to be coming into your multiplayer experience so that everyone's got someone to play with.
No, that makes sense. Absolutely. In fact, I was just thinking there's an example as a game that I love on mobile called The Battle of Polytopia. I don't know whether you remember. It's by Wijuan, a Swedish developer. And then they, I think the single player game is free, but the multiplayer for that is paid for. That's where they monetize. Actually, it was interesting. But yeah, I think you're right. So we've got a couple more questions here, and probably so 3 or 4 minutes that we can talk. So I'll put this to you. We've got. A question here. Any thoughts about the multiplayer of a boss level? Any examples you can think of, and will that excite players?
Yeah, I think that's a very cool idea. Like, I think there's a bunch of games out there that have explored that. Destiny, for example, has done some really cool things with their game design in terms of boss fights, your raids, and they sort of had very interesting twists in terms of how players can engage with the boss, or how to defeat the boss. Even there's quite strong collaborative efforts. And I mean, boss fights are just inherently cool. Idea of that kind of dynamic, I think, is a pretty exciting one. And I think, there's definitely games out there that have touched on that, but could go deeper.
And another anonymous attendee asks, have you ever been in the development of a single player game and made the shift into multiplayer?
Good question. I don't think I have. I think most of the games that I've worked on have been primarily multiplayer focused. So that's probably not very helpful. But yeah, I think either being exclusively single player, which I started out working on games essentially for children, which are very single player, and then later kind of started to get more and more into multiplayer game design.
Great. And I've got another question here. Sorry, I hope you're all right to keep going. We've got a couple of minutes.
Yes, absolutely.
What might be techniques to make asynchronous multiplayer more fun?
I mean, it's it's a good question. I think a big part of a synchronous multiplayer experience, a big part of ensuring it's fun is being able to process what's happening. Because it's synchronous, because everything's happening at the same time, I would say that readability is a very important thing. The beauty of an asynchronous experience is that you get a chance as a player to take a break, take a step back, and digest what's happened, and then make your own move. So in synchronous gameplay, I often think that one of the best things to focus on is the readability of your gameplay and the pace of your gameplay. It depends obviously on who the target audience is, but if you're looking at more sort of teens, and maybe something more fast-paced is fine. Maybe for the more sort of mature gamer, then I would say maybe less so, and a bigger emphasis on making things as clear as possible visually.
Absolutely. We've got one more question. I'm just thinking maybe we can squeeze in this final question before we run out of time. Sai asks, how do you balance progression in normal versus multiplayer modes?
So yeah, I mean, again, it really comes down to the game. I'm going to use Destiny again as an example because it's the first one that comes to mind. So there are certain modes. Destiny is a great reference because it combines a single with multiplayer very well, at least on console. And they tend to have it that the sort of special abilities of your guns are reneged for multiplayer. I think there's a mode at least that allows for that. So again, it really comes down to the genre of the game and what the single player comprises of, or what the game even involves. But there definitely are instances of single player / multiplayer games that put certain restrictions on player abilities or player gear to sort of create a more, I guess, level playing field. But by no means not always. Sometimes it's nice to reward players for their single player progression by saying, hey, you've got a bit of an edge in this multiplayer.
That makes sense. Well, look, I'll tell you what, we'll draw a line there because our next speaker is ready. So a round of applause for Arran. You're going to have to imagine it coming from the whole audience. Thank you very much. We're grateful for you joining us here in this unusual way of doing a conference, but we're settling into it in 2020, aren't we, here at PGC Digital. Thanks, Arran. That was great and really, really practical talk here for our Developer Toolkit track. So thank you. And if people do want to catch up with Arran, of course, details on the screen, or I guess they can find you in the meeting system as well, right? That's
yes, they certainly can. Yep.
Great. Thank you again.